a catastrophe cemetery, a medieval charnel house, a lost chapel, and the plague.
We expected the attrition cemetery, so that's when one person dies and gets buried and 5 years later another person dies. We didn't expect the catastrophe cemetery.
I'm Jessica, the museum guide, and today I'm here at a rare tour of the medieval charnel house beneath Spitalfields Market. This is an incredibly rare chance to head behind this glass and go inside of the medieval charnel house. London is a modern city, yes, but there are reminders all around us that this is indeed a very ancient city, too. The medieval cemetery at Spitalfields is the largest excavated graveyard in the world, and amongst its hidden secrets is the charnel house of Saint Mary's Priory, later called Saint Mary Spital. From a Roman princess's tomb to a catastrophe cemetery to medieval bone stores, we'll learn many interesting secrets today, and how the invention of the internet actually saved them. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm delighted to have you here. Or if you're a regular viewer and you'd like to see even more videos, I release one extra video tour every single month over on my Patreon. I've just linked it below. Saint Mary's Priory was founded in 1197 by wealthy London merchants Walter and Rosa Brunis, and was only the second hospital in London after St. Bart's. St. Mary's was run by the Augustinian order, but remember, these medieval monastic hospitals were really just more places to go and die or lie in rather than to be healed. Its full name was the New Hospital of the Blessed Virgin Mary without Bishopsgate. That means outside of the Bishopsgate, but it came to be known as Saint Mary's Spital, like hospital, and we can still hear the legacy in the name today. This whole area is called Spitalfields Market. Over the 14th and 15th centuries, this was already a poor area, and by the time St. Mary's closed its doors in 1539, it was the largest hospital in London, mainly administering to the poor. We can see it here in a reconstruction, and we're going to learn so much more about it on our tour today. I'm going to insert some clips of the awe-inspiring Dr. Jane Sidell. She's the Principal Inspector for Ancient Monuments for Historic England, and not only is she one of the most respected people in her field, she's endlessly entertaining, and I hope you'll agree that she brings this site to life. By the way, this tour was organized, as it is on an annual basis, by London Month of the Dead, which is a wonderful series of programming all about, you guessed it, burial sites, charnel houses, catacombs that takes place throughout the month of October every year. Give them a follow on social media. And so that is what I have to show you today. A medieval charnel house that helps us to understand a famine. This is one of the most interesting places I have ever filmed, and I can't wait to share it with you. The site's actually down a flight of stairs. Cities build up over time, and we're now down at the street level from around 1,000 years ago. In order to engage with the public, the site is actually visible through this large window, and you can come down here during the market's trading hours. So this is what the site looks like from above. It does have a glass floor, but you could really easily miss it and walk right on top without even noticing. I've come down these steps many times, and I walked past this wall, but I've never noticed this door was here. So let's head inside into the Charnel House archaeological site. Now, before we look around, let's start by getting one thing clear. What is a charnel house? What's an ossuary? And what's the difference? So a charnel house is a building or a vault where human bones are stored, usually to make space in overcrowded cemeteries. Historically, these structures were common in the medieval period and typically had a chapel above them where prayers were said for the dead. The word charnel house comes from carnalis, the Latin for flesh, but the remains here wouldn't be fleshy at all. Instead, they're usually old dusty bones where the flesh has long since rotted away. And by the way, the charnel houses aren't used in every circumstance. Sometimes graveyards just kind of layer cake and continue to add new layers on top without removing old bones. Now, usually medieval burial is very straightforward. There are usually no grave goods, with notable exceptions. There's no crosses, no markers. They dig a hole and you're put inside. Remember, if you are a very notable person, you're probably buried inside of the church. In the churchyards, though, people are buried in straight lines, and those doing the burials just remember where they are. and the information is passed down to the next generation. But as time goes by, you forget where they are. And over time, when you're digging up new graves, you start digging up bits. But when bigger bits emerge, that's when you have a problem. Of course, in the medieval period, there was a belief that on Judgment Day, you needed to be able to walk and talk. You need your skull and your long leg bones. That's the origin of the skull and crossbones on gravestones. Yes, they are a memento mori to remind us that death is coming, but the specific placement of those long leg bones and the skull is because at Judgment Day, we will all need them. Discarding these would have been unthinkable to our medieval ancestors, and so they were saved in charnel houses and also in ossuaries. Now, an ossuary is almost the same thing, but they're usually a little bit more decorative and intentional. They're a special container or a room made to hold the bones of the dead. Sometimes this is a stone box, like this ancient one from Jericho at the British Museum, or sometimes it's an entire series of rooms or chambers. The most famous, of course, is the Catacombs in Paris, or even the famous Sedlec Ossuary in Kutna-Hora, Czech Republic. I've been in the past. I'd love to go back. There, the bones have been made into chandeliers, altars, and coats of arms. Now, we do have a few ossuaries kind of like that in the United Kingdom. I covered the St. Leonard's Ossuary in Hythe in this video linked above. That's one of 2 surviving ossuaries in England. The main difference between an ossuary and a charnel house, then, is usually decorative. In charnel houses, bones weren't usually put on display. They were stacked in orderly piles, as we'll find out later, often accompanied by a chapel where prayers could be said for their souls. But in both cases, they were kept reverentially and kept safe. And that's the purpose of placing them there.
Museums are often in big, old buildings, and it can be difficult to get a strong internet signal. So I have to rely on using public Wi-Fi a lot. Now, of course, that leaves me open to viruses, malware, and hacking. And so that's why I use NordVPN. A VPN is a virtual private network. Think about it this way. It's an online service that creates a private tunnel for your internet connection and hides your online identity. I use the app for my phone, but I also use it on my computer. If you're traveling anytime soon, or you just want to protect yourself at home from fraud, phishing, or malware, you need one. NordVPN also has something that most VPNs don't have, Threat Protection Pro. This alerts you when you're about to fall for a scam or enter a fake online store. But it doesn't make you lose any speed because NordVPN is the fastest VPN on the planet. Best of all, it's incredibly easy to use. Even my mom uses it, for real. If you're not using a VPN, you're taking a huge risk, and it's just not worth it. Just head to www.nordvpn.com/museumguide to get 4 months extra when you sign up for a 2-year plan. It's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk at all. Again, that's www.nordvpn.com/museumguide. Now let's get back to the charnel house already.
Normally, a charnel house is very small, so this is highly, highly exceptional and large. It's also very decorative, though that might be hard for us to see now. Let's let Jane Sidell point out some of the different stones.
Now I need you to mentally remove the bricks. They were added later when this wall of the charnel house was used as the boundary wall of the Honourable Artillery Company. And some of you that will know the area will know that the artillery company have land here and have practice grounds here. But what we have here is a combination of stone types. So this is an Neolithic limestone, is effectively a very shelly sort of bath stone. We have the flint. Flint's really rare in London. All building stone in London comes from somewhere else. There isn't any natural building stone. But flint is really, really rare. It's not a tradition here at all. When you see it somewhere like Southwark Cathedral, that's part of very late Victorian refacing. So to get this in a medieval building is very strange. All this stuff down here, this is all the foundation, so this is the bit that nobody would have seen. Kentish ragstone, we guess as well. But we've also got coalstone in here. So when it was fresh, it would have been very beautiful and very decorative and very unusual. And given that only dead people were kept in here, it's interesting that it is so decorative. I should just note that the bones here are not human, so these were packing again and they would have been hidden by mortar. So those are cow bones. So there are no human bones visible today.
Now, when it was first built, it would have been very beautiful and very decorative. The charnel house below, the chapel on top, and this is where masses for the dead were conducted and possibly where new burials were laid out. Remember, this was a separate building from the church and separate from the hospital. Those buildings are long gone, but this one survives.
This is the base of the staircase. There probably would have been a wooden staircase on this stone base. Coming in here, the reason that you have to bend down is the original medieval threshold is there. You came in the way people would have come in. So the monks would have come in here bringing bits and probably put them on the correct pile. So there would have been a certain amount of light from these windows, which would have given light. So that's the south. There would have been, we assume, windows on this side as well. So some daylight would have come in, but on the whole it would have been dark and gloomy. There might have been candles. We recreate a certain amount of that. And it would have probably been a bit musty and earthy smelling and a bit damp.
So now let's ask, how was it discovered? And then we'll get back to the question of why it's so large and here in the first place. Well, we need to cast our minds back to the 90s. That's when, owing to some zoning disputes and a rapidly gentrifying East End, the formerly rough and ready Spitalfields Market was saved from demolition and reimagined as a shopping and dining hub. At the same time, the London International Financial Futures and Options Exchange, it's a mouthful, wanted to build a new trading floor here, and they were threatening to go to Germany if they weren't allowed this space. Now, it was known that the historic Saint Mary's Priory had been somewhere around here, and so building a modern new building with the deep foundations required would churn all of that up and destroy it. That's bad, right? But this was too much money to lose. The government wasn't about to let all of that money walk away to a different country. So it was decided that an archaeological survey would take place first and just get an assessment for the site, at least catalog it if it was going to be lost, and also remove any human remains. This entire development was designed by Foster and Partners, which is led by Norman Foster. He's also famous for the Gherkin and the British Museum atrium. I mean, I look at that all the time. The project was actually criticized as being bland, but I really like the way that it plays around with the scale and design of the original Victorian Spitalfields Market, the height of the different glass buildings. Of course, there's the whole issue of gentrification in Spitalfields and the ever-encroaching creep of the City of London, aka the financial district. But that's a topic for another day, and trust me, I can talk endlessly about that. So for the site survey, it was conducted by Museum of London archaeologists. They originally estimated that about 3,000 medieval burials would be discovered here, and that was in line with other similar sites. It would have been the largest such excavation ever completed. However, they didn't know at the time that the charnel house had survived. They thought it might be here, but they also knew that it may have just been demolished and destroyed when those other buildings were lost. They weren't specifically looking for this when they did indeed find it, but it's not the first thing they found. Within this massive 10-acre site, fascinating aspects of lost London were revealed. The earliest find was an extensive Roman cemetery. It's funny that that was the first find, and it's also chronologically the earliest. Now, it included this now famous stone sarcophagus containing a decorated lead coffin and the remains of a woman. She's sometimes known as the Spitalfield Princess, and whose facial reconstruction was on display in the Museum of London. Now, sadly, today, I can't include any Museum of London artifacts to complement this video, even though there would be a lot of really cool things I could probably show you. And that's because the Museum of London is in the middle of a 5-year massive reimagining and relocation. I'll be doing a video tour of that museum, hopefully as soon as it opens. And I'll make sure to point out some of the things that were excavated here at Spitalfields. But even after the discovery of the Roman cemetery, the charnel house, of course, was still waiting for them. The team was just planning to learn about the buildings of the priory, but they found bodies, and more bodies, and more bodies.
Because we were looking to learn more about the layout of the cemetery, learn more about the buildings of the priory, and boy did we do that in spades. Because what we discovered was we did find burials from the beginning of the foundation in 1197, But we also found burials from earlier, from about AD 1000, which surprised us quite a lot. We found out the dating later through a programme of radiocarbon dating, which we undertook carefully because radiocarbon dating is destructive. You need a very small bit of bone and you don't get it back. So we found out that there were burials here nearly 200 years before we realised. So there must have been a parish and there must have been a parish church. What we didn't expect, and which nearly brought us to chaos and grief, is we expected the attrition cemetery, so that's when one person dies and gets buried and 5 years later another person dies. We didn't expect the catastrophe cemetery. So we started finding mass graves. So a mass grave is anything from about 5 up, because often you might get 2 or 3 burials in one grave, particularly if it's been a hard winter and there's a lot of poorly elderly monks. But we started finding mass graves.
Now, of those bodies, around 6,500 are now in the collection of the Museum of London, which has 20,000 bodies in its collection, by the way. And the remainder, along with all of the loose charnel, went for careful reburial. By the way, if you want to learn more about reburials in cases like this, I talk about it a lot in my video about the London Necropolis Railway.
The 400 mass graves were underneath where I'm walking right now, covering pretty much the entire site of all these office towers and Spitalfields Market itself. The Roman burials were roughly at the edge of the site where this goat statue is now.
Now, they were expecting medieval graves as early as 1197. Remember, that's when Saint Mary's Priory was founded. But they also found burials from as far back as the year 1000, indicating that there had been a parish church here even earlier. Now, it is these earlier burials combined with the Catastrophe cemetery. Now, that's what led to such a large charnel house. See, when a large number of people have to be buried, the earlier burials were dug up and placed here in the charnel house. The bones that came to rest in this unusually large charnel house were not from the cohort of the 10,000 who died around the year 1320. They were the bits and pieces of those earlier burials. And as we'll discover later on as well, parts of the charnel house too, not just the cemeteries, not just the burials, but the charnel house, the structure, predates the priory of 1197, again hinting at that earlier parish church. Now, you might think that these burials, a huge amount all at one time, that the cause has to be the plague, right? Well, that's what the archaeologists thought at first.
You know that London is covered with plague pits? Not at all. It isn't. It's a myth. It's an urban myth. London has one Black Death plague pit. It's over at East Smithfield, close to the Tower of London, and it's the only one that's known.
There are only a few mass graves in London from the plague, and only a few plague pits. I only recently learned this. Lots of burial grounds contain the bodies of plague victims, but they can't be described as mass graves or plague pits like I've just described, where lots of people are buried kind of at one time in one large grave. And I hate to say that in one of my past videos about the strangest graveyards in London, I gave misinformation. I described the Charterhouse as a plague pit, when in fact it is an attrition cemetery that contains some bodies of plague victims. Normally, when you excavate medieval graveyards, you're excavating people who died of illness or advanced age, and of course many childhood diseases, but you tend to get the same kind of body over and over again. However, the plague kills young and old alike, so you get a very interesting cross-section of society to learn more about medieval life. Remember, one of the hallmarks of Black Death skeletons is that the illness leaves no lasting mark, so it's actually very difficult to tell, even for archaeologists, the cause of death. The Black Death is very quick, and it doesn't change the skeletal remains, and that makes it hard to distinguish the plague dead from other kinds of illnesses. While we may have been able to see this illness on the flesh when the person was freshly dead, we cannot see it on the bones, like we would be able to see with some cancers, with syphilis or tuberculosis, or in some cases with starvation, as we'll talk about very soon. By the way, speaking of tuberculosis, around 100 of the Spitalfields skeletons did preserve traces of the disease on their skeleton, and that made up about 2% of the overall study group. As only between 5% and 7% of those infected with TB have permanent skeletal scarring, that means as many as 30% of the population may have been sufferers. That's a really high incidence, and it's just one of the many things that archaeologists have been able to learn from Spitalfields. So, we've got some tuberculosis visible, but no other obvious cause of death. So it must be the plague. Wrong. When these bones were radiocarbon dated, they predate the plague, which was 1348 to 1349. So what if it wasn't the plague? Well, you've heard me mention the term catastrophe cemetery a couple of times now, and that's the correct term for a cemetery that has to deal with a large influx of the dead in a very short period of time. Now think about the kinds of catastrophes that could warrant this. They include natural disasters, disease, like the plague, warfare, and famine. And in this case, it appears that a vast number of people died very quickly from starvation. Of course, I mentioned this was a poor area, and you can see here from the striations or grooves on this girl's teeth, this is indicative of long-term starvation. Her life was very, very hard, but most of the bodies don't have this. There was quite a shift in the climate at this period. There was a great volcanic eruption in 1258 that caused a huge famine. But there was also another volcanic eruption in the global south in 1317 or 1318. For the next few years, the volcanic activity led to poor weather and poor harvests multiple years in a row, preventing people from building up a surplus, and eventually there was simply no food. People left the countryside in droves and came here to London looking for food and looking for work. Though Holywell Priory was actually just down the street in Shoreditch and therefore closer for most newcomers to London, they didn't have a hospital. Remember though, Saint Mary Spital was one of the largest in London, and people ended up here in their final days of starvation. These were times marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism. In this illustration from the Biblia Paupernum, illuminated at Erfurt around this time, famine points to her open, hungry mouth. It's devastating to think about. But remember, the fear of death, and even more so of purgatory and hell, defined medieval life. And so if you could do something to curry favor with God, decrease your time in purgatory, and make it to heaven, you would do so. And so that is likely why wealthy patrons had this built. The charnel house below in the undercroft and the chantry above. A chantry is a place where you can pay, literally through donations called indulgences, to have monks and nuns chant prayers for your immortal soul and lessen the impact of the naughty things you may have done. Despite the prayers from the rich, the more than 10,000 people buried in the 400 mass graves and Catastrophe Cemetery then displaced earlier bones that were moved in here into the charnel house. So now we know how it was found and why it was built here in the first place. But why did it survive when none of the other buildings did? Well, it only survives through a series of very specific and fortuitous events. In 1538 and 39, Henry VIII, eager to flex his authoritarian muscle over the Catholic Church, ordered many of the country's religious buildings to be destroyed. That's why the remnants of the actual church, Saint Mary's, are just a few feet of foundation. The building was torn down. But this building could be sold, and Henry was always in need of money for wars. He and the chancellor, who was responsible for the finances of the dissolution, the aptly named Richard Rich, began selling off everything that they could. This was a nice, solid piece of architecture, and though it had religious uses, it wasn't a church. It was sold on, and the chapel became a house. This undercroft, the charnel house, with its foundations beneath the ground, became the kitchen and cold storage. The charnel was cleared out, mostly.
And most of the charnel, most of the bits of bones were cleared out because we found some. So we found a pile in that corner and we found a pile in that corner, but very little. However, this was lived in as a house. And what happened was the bulk of this was cleared out and we don't know where it went. So at some point, hopefully, we're going to find it. And whilst it won't tell us much about individuals, it will tell us more about disease. It may have been as simple as big piles of individual bits. The chances are the skulls would have been together, the pelvises would have been together, the long bones would have been together.
Where are the bones now? The charnel. It's actually a mystery.
The archaeologists didn't find much of it. Dr. Sidell says they hope to find it one day, perhaps in one of the ditches that Shoreditch is named for. But what really saved what's left of this building was the fact that it was used as a dumping ground for burned out debris from the Great Fire of London in 1666. That's just one of many instances of the City of London pushing their undesirable matter into the East End. But that means it was never left vacant for people to come in and nick all of the stone, or for it to collapse in on itself, and the footprint of the building survives. Now let's have a little wander around the building itself and note some of its architectural quirks.
You can see and appreciate just how weird and funky it is. So some of you will have been looking at this central rib going, that's a bit weird. And you'd be right, because that's Norman, that's Romanesque dogtooth architecture, and that dates to about 1140. So that predates the founding of the priory, and it might be associated with that earlier burial ground. Architecturally, it means that this space doesn't really work at all, because that would describe a semicircle, whereas these ribs come up to a point, so we don't know how the ceiling works. But it's just so unusual. It's absolutely wonderful, and it's why it was so important to have that fight to preserve things.
But we have one more piece of the story. How is it maintained today? And if the financial exchange guys wanted to build above, how are we standing here now with someone mopping above our head? Where is the financial trading floor? Well, remember, I said that the internet saved the archaeological site. It's true. Now, it was the late 90s. This is a very pivotal moment in time, and the internet revolutionized financial trading, and so all of a sudden, they needed a lot less space. The archaeologists, including Jane Sidell, were able to convince the developers that the Charnel House was special enough to be saved.
And a few of us just thought, this building is so exceptional, what can we do? Because it's 14th century, almost every 14th century scrap of building in London is a church. And this is not, it's a different form of building, it tells a different story.
And thankfully, the Spitalfields development agreed. Foster and partners redesigned the entire scheme, even though they already had bulldozers on site. The entrance to underground parking is actually just behind this wall. They managed to squeeze in what they needed while leaving this site intact. One other thing I want to point out is this art piece by David Teeger Portman. It's called Choosing the Losing Side, and it was installed in 2014. If you come down to visit this site just from the other side of the window, it's the main thing that you're going to see. It's meant to evoke tomb figures with the faces of bronze figures wearing masks. According to the artist, they represent the history of figurative representation. They're kind of stand-ins for the people here in our lost charnel house. The story of a people starving to death here in England caused by climate change. But it's also the story of a mad scramble to find a place to bury the bones of the dead in a respectful way. I think this is absolutely fascinating and very eerie, and I hope you agree. So if you'd like to take a tour like this and visit the Spitalfields Charnel House, keep your eye on the London Month of the Dead social media accounts, or get in touch directly with Spitalfields Market to see the next time Jane Sidell is taking people into this space. It's an amazing experience.
I've been so incredibly lucky to explore this charnel house today, and what an awesome opportunity offered by London Month of the Dead. I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum or in the charnel house.